Motherless Brooklyn by Jonathan Lethem. We know we've all been reading it, and we're going to talk to Jonathan in just a little bit. Because it's kind of a special evening, we have two special guests, two very different and wonderful musicians from New York City. One picked by Jonathan at a $75 bill, the duo. I know they're listening in. Hi. And at the end of the whole event, we're going to hear from Jordana Lee from Lincoln Center. She has some really interesting news about Lincoln Center. She's going to give us to us exclusively tonight. That's exciting. And then a performance that was made specifically for essential workers in New York City. So we have a whole lot coming up. We'll also announce our next book club, which some of you may know already, but we'll give it the big announce anyway. But let's get on to the main event. Jonathan Lethem's Motherless Brooklyn. As you know, it's a perfect book for a book club celebrating New York. You talk about the Upper East Side, we got Greenpoint, we've got Brooklyn. Let me tell you how many people were able to check out the book from the library because of our partnership with the New York Public Library. 3,473 of you checked out a copy of Motherless Brooklyn. You also might want to check out Jonathan's new novel called The Arrest. It's kind of wild. But the book we're talking about tonight is Motherless Brooklyn, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction. Jonathan Lethem, welcome.
Thank you. It's so fun to be part of this. Thanks for having me.
When you were on our show in December, we had a little preview of this event, and you said that Motherless Brooklyn is a book you always enjoy revisiting and talking about. Why do you think you have such a fond relationship with the story?
Well, I mean, it's a feedback loop. It's always been the book of mine that I think has inspired the most, by far the most affection. People want to know Lionel. They want to hang out with Lionel. In fact, sometimes I feel like I'm expected to be as fun as Lionel, and I'm kind of a disappointment to people because I made up somebody who's more lovable, I think, than certainly than myself, and maybe than the average fictional character. Certainly for me, my characters tend to have a little bit of an edge, be a bit disaffected or alienated or difficult. But Lionel, there's something about him that leans toward the reader, and so the embrace of this character, in my experience, means that people are lit up in a particular way when they want to talk to me about this book, and that's just always been a kind of a treat for me, a kind of nourishment.
It was really fun to read, especially with the idea of this framing of loving New York, because we recognize the streets names and we recognize the Upper East Side. And there's a reference. I went in the Wayback Machine, J&R Music World, where he's getting a cassette for his Walkman. Does the book, when you reread it, I don't know if you reread it recently, is it really, did you mean to make a time capsule?
Well, so the context for my writing Motherless Brooklyn was I'd been living away from New York for my whole young adulthood, all through my 20s. And my first 4 novels were written in California, and they were all really not about New York. I'd sort of avoided this really prominent main part of my own life and experience. And then in the late 90s, I moved back to New York City and kind of began to fall in love with it and also connect to it in a different way, where I realized how much it formed me, and it formed my language, and it formed my way of thinking and my personality. So the book is a kind of a mash note. It's a big Valentine upon this return. I was just seeing the streets of Brooklyn with this unbelievably affectionate eye, and I wanted to catalog a lot of what I loved. I wanted to sort of name things for what they were, to talk about the sandwiches and the streets and the language of the streets, the vernacular, and catch some of what meant so much to me.
It was interesting. As I stumbled on that one page, I'm stuck on the J&R Music World because it is such of a moment. And I thought, wow, could you have told this story in 2018? Or has the internet made that impossible? Do you know what I mean? They would have been able to find out everything about the characters.
There's a lot of stuff that's now a historical novel, but that's what fiction does, is it freezes contemporary life, and you can sort of see how much it's changed. I mean, in a very particular way, of course, the internet and cell phones make writing crime stories really difficult now. A lot of the ways that people are ordinarily like in the dark and looking for clues or wondering whether people are good or bad, you know, now you would just kind of Google them, and you can't really be out of contact with people the way it used to be. I think it's really tough for serious writers of mysteries and thrillers. Although I'm really just kind of in this book especially, I'm just playing with the form. But the other thing that's changed, and I think it's really changed profoundly, is that people are much more familiar with Tourette syndrome than they were when I, set out to write it. It was something that could still really surprise you. It had surprised me. I only learned about it a few years before I began researching it, before I became fascinated with it and began researching it for the book. And now some kind of corner was turned, and there were a certain number of characters in television shows and movies and, memoirs by people with Tourette's and celebrities with Tourette's who are open about it. And I think you could never write about it quite the way I did, where everyone seems to be learning about it only because Lionel exists.
We got so many questions about Tourette's and about how you came to it and your experience with it. I'm curious about, from your research, what in your research helped you create Lionel and help create his particular tics?
Well, so the first thing I should explain is that I found out about Tourette's by reading essays by Oliver Sacks. And he's got two different case studies, one in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and another one in a book called An Anthropologist on Mars. And each of these are so compelling to me, and they were so overwhelmingly interesting to me, because there was something about Tourette's, as soon as I learned about it from Sacks' writing, that seemed to reach into me. It seemed to speak to me, which is not the same thing as saying that I was self-diagnosing, because I don't think that anyone would diagnose me as having Tourette's syndrome. But there was something about it as a description of a neurological experience, a relationship to language, and a kind of reactivity, that I did feel that I was discovering something or considering a description that amplified my sense of myself. And so I did have to research it, and I did everything I could to surround myself with information and description, and to meet people with Tourette's and let them talk to me and inform me. But I never would have begun that journey into research if it hadn't also, in some sense, been a responsive moment for me, where I felt, oh, there's this, somehow this involves me, even though it doesn't seem to. I'm drawn into a relationship to it that's personal.
We asked our readers, we do these Instagram questions out. All right, we asked our readers how they thought Lionel's Tourette's enhanced or complicated this detective story. One person wrote to say, quote, "It added verbal texture to the narration." Another wrote, "Readers and characters trust him because they think he has no choice but to speak his mind." How do you think Tourette's helps Lionel as a detective?
I like that. I like both of those descriptions very much. And that last one, the sense that he's he's almost wearing his brain on the outside, that anyone can meet him and sort of experience what he's thinking. One of the origin points for my notion of putting Tourette's together with the traditional hard-boiled detective story was that I, as a great fan of Humphrey Bogart movies and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and Ross MacDonald, it seemed to me that the signature characteristic of the hard-boiled detective is their verbal mastery. This is a character who's in the dark. They don't know what the plot is. There are invisible forces. They're outgunned and outnumbered by both the police and the criminals, and they tend to exist in a space somewhere between those two. But the one thing they have, and this is very typical of Bogart's portrayal of the hard-boiled detective in The Big Sleep and Maltese Falcon, is that they walk into any given room and they kind of run verbal rings around the other characters. They have command. Their wisecracks and their interrogation and their sarcasm that's what makes them who they are. And in a way, that's what it is to be hard-boiled. And so the idea of a character who was almost the ultimate opposite of this, it was like a soft-boiled detective. He had no verbal control. He was almost at the mercy of language in every situation and in every scene. It struck me as a very funny idea, and also one that would make the mechanics of the detective story really visible in an interesting way. You would see how the idea of this character entering a room and interrogating or trying to learn things or trying to command the people around them really operated.
I have to ask you about how you came up with the string of words that would be in Lionel's tics, because there were different ones that just I kept marking which ones I liked, and there was one when he and Tony are talking about, and Tony's talking about Batman, and Batman always gets away, the supervillain will never learn, and Lionel says, "Uncle Batman," I shouted. That couldn't know how much work it was for me to keep my hands on the dashboard, my neck straight. This is one just made, "Uncle Bailey, Blackman, Barnum, Batmanopotamus."
Thank you. I'd forgotten that one.
How did you, when you were trying to develop those strings, because they make sense?
Well, I hope that they all are doing productive work as well as being absurd and surreal. One of the things that I loved growing up was overt nonsense. Lewis Carroll and the poems of people like Edward Lear, and I love Dr. Seuss, and I memorized some of my favorite Dr. Seuss books, and there are those like On Beyond Zebra where they go past just unexpected combinations of the English language and into, in a sense, a kind of new language, an invented language, which is also what Lewis Carroll does, like in a poem like The Jabberwock. And I think that, and of course, these things point towards, some kind of high literature. It's like, if you're on the road through Lewis Carroll, eventually you're going to end up at James Joyce. But I was never quite as exalted as that. I kind of wanted to have my regular storytelling and my nonsense at the same time. And so I loved to invent characters who would sort of represent the principle of the absurd and would speak in a crazy way. If you look at the books that precede Motherless Brooklyn, there tends to be some small part, some walk-on, some minor character or small group of characters who kind of keep alive this spirit of nonsense. And in a way, Motherless Brooklyn was just me calling my own bluff and saying, what if I, instead of putting this character at the margins, what if I made that nonsense talker into the narrator of the book? What if I put them in charge of the entire language system? And, it was a chance to play. What you hear, what you're reading aloud to me is the sound of me playing and having fun. It was a gas to write the book. But I did have to subject them in revision to the pressure to make them all meaningful. It was in a sense, it was easy to smash syllables together. What was difficult was to resolve them in a way that generated narrative meaning. And I tried my best to make them all meet that test.
Before we leave the subject, we did get this question from several people. Jonathan, have you received any feedback from people with Tourette's?
Oh, sure. I mean, it was an enormous part of my life for the years just following publishing this book, and a really rewarding experience. I wrote it relatively incognito, although I did, thanks to incredible luck, I became acquainted with Oliver Sacks, and he introduced me to a couple of really eloquent and charming and marvelous friends of his, because they weren't really his patients. They were just people with very interesting and overt cases of Tourette's who Oliver was interested in. And one in particular named Shane Fistel in Toronto, I spent some time with, and he wasn't so much the model for Lionel as he was my weather vane. He was his reactivity and the amount of language and behavior that he generated was so extraordinary, and he was so unembarrassed about it. He was so in a way interested in, and he saw it as his self-definition. So he gave me a lot of permission just by his existence. But I mostly learned by reading things. And it was after the book was published that I found my life in a way surrounded by the Tourette's community, because I'm grateful to say I'd done at least enough, even if I made some exaggerations or distortions, I'd done enough to clarify the one thing that they are most adamant about. And this is less a problem now because people are more well-informed, but it was in the 20th century. A big problem was that it was mistaken for a form of emotional disorder, of a kind of madness, when in fact it's a pure neurological dysfunction. And since I'd specified that so carefully, the community of people in Tourette's advocacy, which consists not only of the people who suffer Tourette's, but their families, often the parents are the drivers of the Tourette's advocacy community, they kind of swept me up. They were like, okay, we like your book, so now you got to come do some work for us. So I spent a couple of years going to a lot of conferences and sitting on panels, and often I would be the one person in a room full of people who had an urgent and heartrending reason to be there. They'd grown up with Tourette's, or they'd raised a child with Tourette's, and they were educating others, and they were also doing outreach to other people who were in this situation, who felt isolated. And I became kind of I'm not sure the word is
ally?
Ally, yes, an ally or a kind of spirit animal. I was like a friend of the Tourette's world for a while, which was incredibly rewarding for me. Mostly I didn't talk, I listened, because I'd already exhausted my real knowledge about their world in the book. And so everything I learned subsequently, I almost could have written another book about that experience.
Let me ask you about some of the relationships in the book, Motherless Brooklyn, specifically between Minna and Lionel. Minna scooped up these boys, these Minna men from an orphanage, but there seems to be a truly, really special relationship between Lionel and Minna. And we asked our readers what they thought. If they thought Minna, despite him not being who he said he was, that Minna, had he ultimately been a positive influence on Lionel's life? And 68% said yes. 32% said no. That's a lot of yes, considering Minna brought Lionel into a life of organized crime. What do you think? Was Minna good for Lionel?
I love the question. I love that we have like an actual voting tally. I'm on the yes team. I think that the thing about Minna is he's a permission to be character. He has a strange effect where he lets other human beings exist, and that he did this for Lionel, who needed it, I guess you'd say, more badly than most of us, although we all need this permission to be. And for that, as much as Frank Minna is obviously, yes, a criminal, and also, he's not exactly politically correct. He's a chaotic character and a self-destructive character. There's something about him that's lovely to me, and so I would probably vote with the majority on that one.
Well, if you like numbers, I have more numbers for you. Let's talk about Julia and the women in the novel. We asked our readers about halfway through, people who are reading Motherless Brooklyn, where they thought Julia had something to do with her husband's death. 33% thought she was involved. 67% said she was a red herring. So we meet her early in the novel, and then we don't hear from her again. Yeah. Was that always the choice?
I'm going to have to plead improvisation, and I was learning what my story was as I wrote it, and I was still 5 novels in, learning how to tell stories. And I think that probably there's something a little lopsided that you're detecting in that query. And as I recall, I think my feeling about Julia was that she was a victim, not a perpetrator. And that, what I wanted to do with that character was, in a way, raise the specter of the most problematic for me part of traditional film noir or hard-boiled detective fiction, which is that there tends to be a femme fatale. You know, it often all gets pinned on the woman in the end of the story. And I thought what was interesting to me, but maybe is somewhat incomplete, it didn't become the center of this story, but the thought I was having about the femme fatale was that Julia herself had mistaken herself for one, but wasn't one. That she wasn't part of the plot. She didn't have a lot of power, but she'd been cast by circumstance, tradition, by the figure she cuts as she moves through this world. She'd been cast in the role of the femme fatale, and in a sense had drunk some of the Kool-Aid herself on that. She was one of the people who'd kind of fallen for that red herring, along with the reader.
Well, as I said, a lot of our listeners loved Motherless Brooklyn and have a lot of questions for you. So I'm going to get out of the way and ask some of their questions.
Great, thank you.
Katie Stanford writes, I listened to the audiobook and the narrator was excellent. Did Jonathan have a say in picking who would narrate the book?
Well, you know, so this is a funny thing about this particular book. There exist, I don't know if they're both easy to find anymore, 2 audiobooks of Motherless Brooklyn. And the first one was done by the actor Steve Buscemi. And
wow, I like
sounds marvelous, and it was marvelous, but it also was a strange thing that is very rare nowadays, which is the world of audiobooks was still not as confident a one as it's become, and it was abridged. And they lopped out about 25% of the language to make it move more quickly. So there's this wonderful Buscemi performance on this, for me, slightly regrettable abridgment of the novel, but that's out there somewhere. I'm forgetting the name of the one that's more likely the one you refer to, which is complete. It's the whole text, and it is also extraordinary. You know, as I recall, I was given, and this is typically the case for me, and I think a lot of authors might have the same experience. I was given a kind of a menu of 3 or 4 voices and asked for an opinion on which person, which actor or voice performer ought to do it. They're always so incredibly good. I mean, any of these people who make it their living to do audiobooks, their capacities are extraordinary. And having done a couple of audiobooks myself and sat at the mic and tried to make something come alive, and I know mine are not as good as these voice performers' results. And so I know what a thing it is to do it right. So I'm glad you liked it.
Ayaka says, I haven't seen the movie, but I understand it's very different. Time, setting, plot, characters. How do you feel about that as an author?
So this is another good story. I met Edward Norton when he first optioned the book, which was now over 20 years ago, because it happened. The book wasn't even published. It was circulating in galleys, and he became interested in it and caused a movie company called New Line to acquire the rights so that he could work with it. And we had a conversation almost immediately. Weirdly, it was in Toronto, and it was on the set of a film called Death to Smoochie. And
remember that movie?
Yeah, not everyone does, but he remarkably had a vision from the very beginning, which was he wanted to bring the material of traditional film noir, the 1950s, the detective milieu that was more characteristic of the kind of books that I'd grown up emulating when I wrote this book, and take it out of the present day and move it into the past. And he also wanted to do what he did do, which is introduce elements of gentrification and urban renewal and race into the story that weren't really anything but kind of just lurking. They were implications maybe around the edges of this story. I thought this was all really thrilling, and I liked it on principle too, because I usually like movies that are really different from the books that give them their source. To me, the history of people trying to make very, very faithful adaptations tends to lead to kind of stilted and uncinematic films. And I usually like it better when a director just grabs onto some elements, some images, some set pieces, and makes something completely new and, its own creature. So that then you end up with these two artifacts that are side by side and they have a relationship, and it's an interesting charged relationship, but they're not trying to be identical to one another, because I don't think it works. I don't think books and films can be identical.
Donna said, I lived in Red Hook from 1978, so it was great to hear all the streets I knew before they were gentrified. And I was thinking about that. I remember for a while the real estate industry tried to call that area Bacoca, Borum Hill.
There was even a Bacoca Cafe.
Bacoca. When was the last time you strolled around that area? And what do you think about when you were in this gentrified part of Brooklyn now?
So in the last reply, I alluded to the way the film introduces thoughts about gentrification and race and urban renewal and the kind of deeper urban subjects. Those are also ones that preoccupy me. And the book I wrote immediately following Motherless Brooklyn was a book called The Fortress of Solitude, where I, instead of writing a Valentine and a kind of a fantasy about this place, I tried to dig into some of the extremely complex legacy of my own experience of growing up in what was Gowanus and became Borum Hill, because I was very much an intimate witness to the early definition that became the target of such a gigantic, and I mean, it's an overwhelming gentrification now. It's been taken and made into a kind of a playground neighborhood where movie stars live. Well, when I was first a kid on that turf, we had as many bricked up windows and abandoned houses as we did well renovated ones. And we had rooming houses on Dean Street. And it was a very, very, I guess I'd say, deeply mongrel neighborhood. It didn't even have a traditional name. It was South Brooklyn, or maybe it was North Gowanus, or it was just where you were when you were not yet in Park Slope or Brooklyn Heights. And seeing what's become of it is something that's so strange and intense for me that I couldn't answer your question easily. I had to write a very long autobiographical novel to begin to say how mixed up I was and how moved I was by all of the contradictions that emerged from that experience.
There's so many good questions. I'm having a hard time choosing. It's sort of broad, but I think interesting. Louise on Instagram asks, how did you create such different settings? They make the book great. From the Zendo Eastern philosophy experience to the backseat of a car where someone's going to their certain death, to the intimate spaces with Kimmery and Lionel.
That's great. I like that a lot. I mean, I think about settings all the time. And of course, this book had a sort of a home ground, right? It was the streets of the neighborhood. And it also had a house style, if you will, or a room tone, because in the neighborhood, people talk, and they talk urgently, and they talk a lot, and they make sarcastic jokes. And Lionel had Tourette'S, and people were full of insults and banter, and there was a lot of aggression. So what I did, and this is something I might not have been able to enunciate at the time, but I can see it clearly in retrospect, I looked for contrast. If New York and the babble of voices were going to predominate in this story, then I was going to want to contrast those with their total opposites. So by looking for Zen Buddhism and moving the story into a Zen monastery where people are trying to have a collective silent meditation, it was a way of exemplifying and also making very funny the difference between the two. And I think I reached for that again when I moved the story to the woods, to Maine, I mean, one of the things growing up as a New York, basically a street kid, you only know the canyon of the streets. I mean, you might have a scrap, you might go to Prospect Park, but you're never out of sight of rooftops. And there can be a kind of terror of the open sky. I knew a story about a kid when I was growing up whose parents took him on the F train to Coney Island, and when he got out under the sky on the beach, he started weeping in terror because he wasn't enclosed enough. And so Lionel is a product of this kind of, he really doesn't, his body doesn't know what it's like to be out of that space. So I wanted to thrust him by putting him into coastal Maine and putting him out on that lighthouse and, among those evergreen trees. I wanted to, again, seek the contrast that would exemplify this idea about who he was.
So dear sweet Lionel, we talked about what a sweetheart he was at the beginning, how much we want to root for him and how people feel warm about him. He ultimately at the end takes his revenge and he does not opt for mercy for the person who is responsible for Minna's death. Why not?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that in some ways I was invested in the imperatives of the crime story. I thought I'd had my liberties with it, but that there ought to be, a pursuit of justice. And in this case, revenge isn't inapt. There's that aspect to it too. But I also felt that this was a story about someone who was trying to become a detective and become autonomous and express his devotion to Frank Minna. And so all of those things drove that result.
Because so much of our conversation was about New York and so much about reading your book was about New York, we asked you, we always have a musical guest on our book clubs. It's sort of a book club meets party. And you said, hey, I really like $75 bill. Could that happen? So we made it happen. Why did you want $75 bill?
Well, for me, I have eclectic musical tastes, and I have a lot of favorites that date back to the era of my own growing up and to even the time when I was writing Motherless Brooklyn, which is a nostalgic part of my life now. But I wanted to pick something really contemporary that also connected to that time in my life. And I think, I was listening to bands in New York City in that period when I was writing the book that were playing small clubs and that were experimenting with incorporating world music and avant-garde music and jazz into, or playing those kinds of things in an amalgamation in rock or alternative or underground settings. And $75 bill just seemed to me to exemplify that. I can feel the thread. They're very much of this moment, but they're so much like the city that I remember and the music that I remember, the culture that I remember at places like Knitting Factory and Che Chen, the guitarist, worked at my favorite record store, Other Music, and I'm so sorry it's not there anymore. And so it's a way of, I guess, celebrating a kind of music I love, but also splitting the difference between nostalgia and the here and now.
Well, thank you for the recommendation, and we're going to hear from $75 bill in just a moment. But first, I want to say thank you, Jonathan Lethem. Thank you so much for being part of our book club. It was a real pleasure.
This was a gas, Alison. Thank you so much. And to everyone who got involved and offered questions, it means a tremendous amount to me.
Jonathan, thanks a bunch.